Hello, and welcome back to the Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis Chapter Summary Series. I'm your host, Ron Rivers, and in this episode, we're going to be covering Chapter 1, The Crisis of Doubt, Desire, Death, and Dogmas. So the crisis of doubt, desire, death, and dogmas is at its root a crisis of spirituality. We have to develop new answers to old questions to kind of reframe our experience of being in relation and alignment with the single truth and the relational universe. So here we encounter the paradox of the crisis of doubt, desire, death, and dogmas. To build a society that maximizes individual actualization for every individual is to build one that also recognizes systemic actualization as part of the process. But systemic actualization requires a certain threshold of individually actualized people in order to realize it. So in many ways, there's nowhere else to begin but the end. So let's talk about doubt. Doubt gives rise to the imposter. The idea that no matter what we do, it'll never be enough, never good enough for ourselves or for others. We are perpetually conditioned by the systems surrounding us to never believe that we're enough, and in turn we internalize that doubt and then project it onto others. The problem with doubt is that when we internalize it, it spreads like a virus. It impacts our vision of the universe, it impacts our ways of acting, thinking, and being, and most importantly, it impacts our interactions with others. It's unlikely that we'll get past doubt because we live in a universe of unknowns. But what we can change is how we frame doubt within our daily interactions and how we, more importantly, react to it when it occurs within our individual time experience. So let's talk about desire. The crisis of desire is that we have an infinite need and want for things that can never be satiated. Now, desire is neither inherently good nor bad. I mean, it can be very exciting and excellent when we channel our desire and embed it in our focus and energy towards things we love, whether it's the building relationships with other people, building projects, and creating things in our vision of the good. That's an excellent use of desire. At the same time, if we allow desire to direct our focus and energy, it's almost always a recipe for some pretty untold disasters. So while it's neither, it is at the same time both. And I also want to emphasize our crisis is not attempting to escape desire. I'm a firm believer that once we kind of reach new plateaus of transcendence within the human experience, we're still going to desire more. What matters is that in our immediate present, the crisis stems from the fact that we are surrounded by systems that exploit our desires in order to capitalize. So the exploitation of desire not only creates new doubts in us, right, because our desires far outweigh our immediate present and progress, but also at the same time create forms of power worship and hierarchy worship. Our desire leads to admiration of those who have reached the pinnacle of the pyramid of wealth. Now, the crisis of death is not that we die. In fact, much of what we've talked about already in our spiritual project is giving death its due. I think one of the major challenges when it comes to death and the crisis of death is that for much of human history, death was usually associated with a slow, painful, grueling, or gruesome death if it was quick. That has kind of embedded this long-term evolutionary fear of ours, right? Like we didn't used to die in hospitals. We used to die because a jaguar, picked us off in the jungle. So there was a lot of different kind of conceptualizations of death and our innate fear of it. Now, I also want to emphasize death not as the ultimate end, but also consider the slow death that many of us experience daily. And that is, I think, the larger crisis of our humanity. When we talk about self-actualization in the age of crisis as a means of unlocking the transcendent potential within the collective human consciousness within a given moment, it's freeing ourselves from the trappings of a reality that we trade in our freedom and experimentalism and imagination for security and a slow grinding death, really an erosion of our spirituality over time. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that death is at the root of all spiritual mythos. Right? It is one of the primary reasons that mythos was developed in the first place. Where our biggest crisis stems from, and my biggest critique of the salvation religions, is that they post paradise, they post divinity after death. So it's permanently inaccessible to the individual. And that I reject in its entirety. In a universe governed by the single truth in the relational universe, divinity must be accessible in the moment. So to that end, we must reject the idea of heaven after death. Okay, we have to give death its due. And by doing that, we empower ourselves to more fully live life in the moment. And finally, the crisis of dogma, which represents really our greatest struggle of the four, is our denial of our doubt, desire, and conflicts about death through our dogmas. In short, we must reject any dogma that projects static worldviews on a universe governed by the single truth and the relational universe.